Good afternoon. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the School of Business at the George Washington University. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this special episode in the George Talks Business Series to celebrate GW's Bicentennial. Today, we are featuring a session on a responsible use of artificial intelligence. And I would like to thank Manoj Saxena, Chairman of the Cognitive Scale and the Responsible AI Institute, for his encouragement, involvement, and help with bringing together this distinguished panel and for partnering with us on this event. And now I'm honored to introduce our panelists. Please join me in welcoming Ashley Kesovan, Executive Director at the Responsible AI Institute, Gavin Munro, Global CIO, Wealth and Personal Banking at HSBC, Alka Patel, Chief of Responsible AI for the Department of Defense, Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, and Rajiv Ronanki, Senior Vice President, Chief Digital Officer at Anthem. Thank you all very much for taking the time to be here with us today. And I'm finally very delighted to introduce Steve Lohr, who reports for the New York Times and has kindly agreed to moderate this session today. Please take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Dean. Appreciate it. First, I've been asked to remind the audience that this is being streamed live on Facebook and YouTube, and that your questions should be sent as comments in those mediums. So let's start. There are more than 100 different organizations around the world that have developed AI frameworks, guidelines, and principles. But our panelists here are all engaged in different ways in trying to make AI actually work and work responsibly. So let's start with Ashley, head of the Responsible AI Institute. Give us its brief history and the distinctive contribution you hope it makes to will make to this field.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you, Dean, for having us here today. We're super excited to be part of this discussion, and you'll notice that we've actually just changed our name. So we were AI Global, and so when I speak about some of the work that we do, that's definitely in the context of AI Global. And just right now, we're launching to the Responsible AI Institute. As was mentioned, I'm the executive director of the organization. And Steve, it's a great question. There's a plethora of organizations that are dedicated to really thinking about the uses of AI, both for positive and for negative or potential concerns that might derive from that. And so that's really where this broad ecosystem of AI ethics or responsible AI, or sometimes called trustworthy AI, really has stemmed from. And in that, as you mentioned, there's many different types of policy, principal documents, reports, research. And my particular interest in this has derived from my work in government, where I was leading the work on developing the government of Canada related to the government's use of AI systems. And in this, really became interested in the practitioner's role. So somebody that's going to be actually building and using technologies, what is it that they need to know in order to build their AI systems and then ultimately deploy them to the public in a responsible and trustworthy manner? And so with this, off of, again, the policy work that I did in the Government of Canada context, was able to then think about, well, how does that scale to other types of sectors, but also to really help people in a broader sense of in the broader community. And so the work that we're doing at the Responsible AI Institute is taking all of that information and working to develop a certification mark for the responsible use of AI systems. We've actually also just launched the beta program for that today. So it'll be both our organization known as Ray Institute, and then the certification mark that we're building in partnership with the World Economic Forum and Short Streetsman Institute at the University of Toronto is the Ray certification.
So this is a set of tools and certifications for practitioners that are going to be developed. Do you have a model in the outside world that you look at as roughly comparable to what you're trying to do?
Yeah, so we're not the first organization that's thought about the role that certifications really stemming from standards or best practices has played. So our model for this has been LEAD, amongst many others in many other sectors, but that's my particular favorite. So LEAD, for many of you might know that it's for the objective of sustainable and green buildings, and similar to what they've done, they think about the various different standards required and bring them all together to make it easier for people that are building and designing buildings to do so in a sustainable manner. So I think that's a close equivalency to what we're doing. Obviously, systems, it raises a lot more questions. I'm sure we'll get into that in the discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ashley. Gavin, let's go to you. In England, at HSBC, one of the senior digital officers there. In finance, math models have been around forever, right? And they've been tested and worked on, whether it's credit standards like FICO or other things. What are you working on in the AI sphere, Gavin? And what is qualitatively different, if anything, about dealing with artificial intelligence applications in the world of finance?
Thanks, Steve. Good question. So, as you mentioned, financial institutions have long used modeled ML and AI in things like fraud and KYC and FICO scores and stuff like that. And we still do today. That's not going to go away. But I think when you think about pay this forward, we want to put AI in the front of our solutions, in the front of our customer. So it's been a benefit for the bank, and the banks have used it for many years. But I think in the next evolution, it'll become part of our day-to-day solutions. So be it a mobile app, be it the phone call when you're calling into the branches, we want our customers to benefit from AI as well. So when we think about making their financial lives better, they could be benefiting from AI through upsells, through better selections of stock picks, through the traditional things like fraud protection. And as we do that, and as we put AI into more applications, it'll become embedded in more day-to-day operations. We need to make sure it's safe and reliable and transparent, and that's where we think about the control framework around that, and it's needed because we're propagating those solutions into the marketplace.
And just one follow-up question. I mean, you have risk management for models for various things. Drill down one level as to how this actually works. I mean, do you have AI kind of red teams testing these models individually, and it's all sort of, each model is bespoke work that is, I assume at this stage, quite labor intensive?
Yes, I mean we categorize the ML AI models in different ways, and those that are deemed critical or high risk, we do that on a manual basis. But I think the point is, as we industrialize this and we put it in more and more applications, we can't sustain that. So obviously we are a regulated industry, and we have we work a lot on what models we can roll out and how we can use these models, and we also get the regulators to verify these models. That is a very intensive process, and it is a very hands-on process.
Okay. Let's shift to Rajiv, Anthem Health. And Rajiv, I'm going to ask you essentially the same question as to what you're doing with artificial intelligence now, and how, again, you're a highly regulated industry. I think as last count, some of this is actually working into FDA approval. There are about 40 or 45 AI software programs that actually have FDA approval now. But again, give us a sort of a context in one of these high stakes fields like healthcare, what you're doing and how it's different from what you've done with automated decision making in the past, if at all.
Sure. Thanks, Steve, and pleasure to be here today. The Anthem mission really is kind of where all of this draws from, Steve. Our goal is to make healthcare more proactive, more predictive, and more personalized. Today, I think we would all agree that as consumers of health in the US, we largely have a sick care system. So some issue happens to us, a chronic illness, a injury, whatnot. You fall sick, and then the system kicks in to take care of you. Where it turns out that in a vast majority of the cases, there are markers, biomarkers, or data that indicate what might happen in a person's future healthcare journey. So if we know that, and we know that in advance, then we can activate the system, the doctors, the caregivers, the patients, in a way that makes healthcare much more proactive and prevent illness from happening in the first place, or decrease the severity of an illness so that people stay healthy. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. And in doing that, change the very notion of insurance to where, rather than sort of risk mitigation, we're about risk prevention. That's kind of the new business model. So to do that, we need to do several things, but the two key highlights are: one is we need to engage our consumers very differently. Like the average person, the only time we think about health is if something happens and there's an issue we need to deal with. Otherwise, it's not like the first thing and top of mind for most people. So how do we make that front and center, topical area of interest for people so that they're proactively engaging on topics of health, and doing it in a way that it's not Big Brother-like, and it's very proactive and simple to understand and use. So that's where AI is being used to personalize solutions for our consumers and engage them better. And a measure for how we're doing on that is to do with NPS scores, Net Promoter Scores, engagement scores, customer satisfaction, and all the things that one would measure to tell us how we're doing on that. And second, we've got over 80,000 employees at Anthem, and a lot of them today work on sort of dealing with the administrative processes of health insurance. So claim submissions, prior authorizations, and all of the minutiae of how the system works today. That's where a lot of the time is being spent. So we're using advanced AI techniques like machine learning to automate some of that work. Whereas, of course, automation is nothing new. We've been doing that for several years. But let's say the automation of the past has been around robotic process automation, which is automating tasks. And now we're automating processes, and we're automating decision making, so that a lot of the things that could be done but a lot of the things that are being done by humans today could be done by machines in the future. And then we could free up the human time in order to focus on issues of health advocacy. So knowing all this data that exists about predicting one's future health, then we can use our employees' time to really reach out, engage our consumers personally, create the relationship and trust, and sort of bring about this change. That's kind of how we're using AI applications today.
And just drill down on the present and sort of the near future on this at one level. I mean, is there a kind of a function, a process that has been dramatically improved that as a result of using these tools?
Yeah, I mean, there's over 4,000 predictions today on everything from the risk of diabetes, hypertension, heart conditions, to risk of falling after orthopedic procedure. And we've had several hundreds of thousands of proactive interventions across our membership base to keep people healthy. So that's here and now, happening every day, and exponentially growing as we speak. And then on the automation side, we've been able to take a lot of the manual effort out of routine customer service inquiries. So if a customer is calling us about claim status or benefits and what's in network, not in network, et cetera, those types of things are handled via conversational AI and kind of like routine customer service type AI, as well as you take a more complex function like claims adjudication, which requires sort of the application of complex policies, complex data, and put it all together to make a decision. We're also using AI to adjudicate claims, and over 90% of our claims are automated using AI and other automation technologies, which leaves a very small percentage of claims to be handled with human intervention.
Thanks, Rajiv. Elko, let's go to you. You joined the Pentagon in early 2020. Tell us a little bit about your background and what you're doing for responsible AI or AI ethics policy at the Department of Defense. So as they say in the Pentagon, what is your mission?
So well said, Stephen. And of course, it had to be one of the panelists, the last panelist, not to unmute themselves. So apologies for that. So yes, what is my mission? A very loaded question, no pun intended there at all, right? So first of all, let me just say thank you. Really excited to be here with all of you. Really humbled to be with such distinguished panelists as well. And, continuing the dialogue on responsible AI is really top of mind for us at the DoD. So I will share just a bit about my background, only to provide the lens and the perspective of how I am thinking about this topic. So started out as an engineer and then was a lawyer for a number of years with tech companies, and then actually practiced at a large financial institution. So love the banking conversation that's going on right now. And then was at Carnegie Mellon University, where I led a research innovation that was focused on AI technology, data analytics, cybersecurity, and privacy, and a lot of the emerging tech issues. And that's where I really got steeped into the conversation around ethics, kind of brought together the technical aspect as well as sort of the legal advocacy aspect. But when I was at the bank, it was right when Dodd-Frank had happened. And that was right when a lot of the regulatory aspects around risk management, compliance, audit, all of those pieces had come together in that regulatory environment. And so really had a chance to see all of that come into play within a large organization, see how the pieces fit together, and have brought that kind of a lens to my role at the DoD. And so I am at the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. We call it the JAIC, and it's effectively similar to a COE, a Center of Excellence within an organization that is focused on thinking about how do we enable and implement AI across the organization? How do we help that transformation to occur? And within the JAIC, we're leading the DoD's efforts with respect to the AI ethics and principles. So there was a separate advisory board called the Defense Innovation Board that spent 2 years thinking about, all right, what kind of principles does the DoD need to be thinking about? What do they need to adopt? And they provided their recommendations after a very lengthy, inclusive, transparent public consultation process. And last year in February, the DoD adopted AI ethics principles. We adopted 5 principles: responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. And my role has really been, all right, how do we take those words on paper and how do we put them into practice, right? How do we operationalize this? And I don't think it's a new sort of challenge. I think any organization that has these principles or guiding principles within their own organizations to sort of put them on the path of how they develop and use these technologies are all struggling with this. How do you actually put it into practice? And so we've taken this approach of having a framework of 4 Ps of people, processes, partnerships, and policy, and using that lens to really help us think through responsible development and use of these technologies. And so, for example, thinking through education aspects, thinking through tools that we might use during the product lifecycle to help us actually provide documentation, transparency from the data to the model to the use. Thinking through partnerships with our acquisition partners and our international allies, and then policy. How do we use policy to bring it all together so that we're all going in the same direction? So we're trying to tackle it all. I think. Of course, the challenge is great, but we need to be, as every day passes, we're losing a day on this conversation, and so really focused on how to put this into practice.
And could you give us where you or your team comes in as an advisor, a listener, whatever, in the development of a product and again, an example obviously would be unclassified?
Sure. Yeah. No. So we did a project last year at the JAIC for COVID-19 on a supply chain logistics, right? And I think back then, right when the pandemic had started, the concern around grocery stores not having supplies, and how do individuals get and find the supplies that they need. And in that process or in that capability development, we really got to try and test out some tools. And what we say with our efforts is, like, we have to be at the table at the very beginning. Ethics does not get tagged on at the very end of a product development process. We are there at the very beginning when the problem is being framed, thinking through all the different stakeholder perspectives, thinking through the possible harms, thinking through, all right, what are the testing parameters and metrics that we need to be thinking about at the very beginning, so that we can have line of sight as we go through the development cycle. But in addition to that, we actually tested out the use of data cards and model cards. We created data cards and model cards, and had a lot of significant learnings from that, not only from the use of a tool, but also from an education perspective as we work with our acquisition partners and our industry partners who are helping us develop these tools. How do we make sure we were using the same lexicon and talking about things in the same way, right? And so kind of bridging that barrier, there was a lot of learnings to be had, not only in the tools themselves, but the process of applying these tools. So at a very high level perspective, we were there at the very beginning and throughout. Of course, that is not fully sustainable from a resourcing perspective, right? And so I think the use of these types of tools, creating sort of tiger teams when necessary to come in and out, having advisory type roles, creating policies, all of those pieces together can complement each other to get to a perfect desired end state.
Okay, thanks, Elka. Let me ask one more somewhat detailed question of Ashley. You have been working, and your group has been working on some pilot projects, I think in healthcare, finance, and if I'm not mistaken, labor. Pick one and tell us, how you're trying to make this sort of step-by-step process toward, certificates and.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Steve. So we are really working to, as you said, in those various different areas, to identify use cases that are of the highest area of concern right now, but also where regulators are looking to start to establish stronger guardrails or more enforcement around some of the existing rules that might exist. So, for example, in finance, fair lending, there's already existing rules and regulations, but thinking about how they apply to machines and machines that have learning capacity is very different than humans that are operating really heavy data analytics. That said, just to get to your question around a specific use case, one of them is automated hiring systems. And one of the things that we're really looking at in this context is trying to understand how they're being used. And like Alka was talking about, how can you put appropriate guardrails around what and how these systems can and should be used? And so we see automated hiring systems really have quite the scope in terms of, are they just filtering different types of applicants, all the way to, are they using biometrics to actually make determinations on whether or not somebody's fit for purpose or fit for that job? And so what we're trying to do with the certification, especially in these high risk or more high risk systems, especially like where biometrics are being used, we're trying to ensure that there's more oversight. So some of the training aspects that Elka's talking about, we want to make sure that teams that are actually utilizing these tools are trained appropriately to evaluate. They know when there's a human in the loop or the need for a human to make a determination if the machine might not have had the appropriate output that was intended or expected. And so one of the things in that circumstance is, at what point do you intervene in the process? And looking for things like making sure that there's a human that's reviewing the false positives and false negatives that might come from those outputs. And so taking this comprehensive view of these systems when doing the evaluation through the certification mark, you can start to make sure that these practices are in place within an organization, and really that they're looking system specific to make sure that they have appropriate, again, knowledge on their human resources side, in order to deploy such systems, but also that they have some sort of checks and balances in place for especially systems that are more innovative and potentially risky.
Thank you. Let's broaden it out to the group in general a little bit with a few more general questions. I mean, new technologies that are powerful are adopted because they have enormous utility and people trust them, basically. This is being watched by Facebook and YouTube, and they are highly controversial in terms of their steering capability and in terms of public discourse and political attitudes, of amplifying certain kinds of things, and they are targets of antitrust actions. And yet the utility is enormous. We use them, and people trust them for the way they use them, generally. I'll ask anybody in the panel this: what's an example of the kind of utility we're going to see? And Rajiv touched on this with personalized medicine, right? And proactive, predictive medicine. But what do you see for the field of AI that people see and say, I got to have this? It's really enhancing life. I mean, over the next, pick your time frame, what looks really good to you?
Steve, I can start. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So again, going back to health, one of the most frequent things that we hear from our consumers is, let's say, it's the average family with young kids at home, and it's 2:00 in the morning, and one of the kids wakes up with a fever. Now, the choice that parents have at that point is, okay, is this something that's routine and, perhaps could be handled with some over-the-counter medication, or is this something more serious that's going to require an urgent care visit? And really, there aren't any tools today or weren't any tools until a short while ago that were an alternative to either taking the risk and, seeing what happened in the morning, or, suffering the inconvenience of going to an emergency room in the middle of the night. So AI today is able to provide an alternative, which, the parents can essentially look at the symptoms, triage what's happening, and with the click of a button, get in touch with a doc via video consult or text or email, and get a response and say, okay, this sounds like it's not very serious, so, sleep well and we'll check it in the morning. Or, yes, it's serious, go take action now. So that's something as simple as that, which is convenience, it's health, it's systematically, in some cases, increases our system-wide cost of health, because if people are in the ER for reasons that are not necessary, then it's increased cost for all of us. So it addresses all of those issues. It's something that we've delivered to our consumers as a result of COVID, and as we saw the results in the uptake of it. Now we've made it available more broadly, and it's one of those things that will, a year or so from now, we'll look back and say, well, how did we ever live without this? That's kind of an example of a utility that we all like, which obviously comes with all of the associated issues around, do you trust it? Is that bias? Is it responsible? And of course, and all the things that we were talking about earlier.
I think, Alka, you have a thought on this? The Defense Department is hugely as a crucial national security issue as well as others. But are there, what's the potential for AI in defense?
Sure. So I will kind of throw out two thoughts. The first is, of course, given the mission of the organization and thinking about national security, the ability to use AI to assist and frankly speed up the decision making or aid in the decision-making process is something that we look to. So I don't know if you may all be familiar, but in the military, we talk about this OODA loop, the observe, orient, act, and decide. And so it's this loop in terms of helping to make decisions, perhaps in different environments or contexts, to either gain situational awareness of a certain situation. And so having a tool that can help perhaps scan a large area and provide information in split seconds, and then the operator can make a decision like that. That is significant, right? In high consequence situations, when you have the ability to have a maximum amount of information that can help you decide whether or not to act or how to act, can be instrumental. On the flip side, too, so along the lines of some of the applications that Rajiv's talking about, I mean, if you think about the military and how large the organization is, and our families and the people who work at the Defense Department, many of those applications also apply to us in terms of workforce internally from a business operations perspective, but also from a health perspective as we think about our military's health, as we think about hiring aspects. So all of these typical applications that are being discussed in the industry perspective or from that industry lens also has some applicability and utility within the DoD as it does its day-to-day business operations. So I think there's sort of two aspects about it when we think about the potential that AI can provide in terms of the military context.
Okay, great. Gavin or Ashley? And Gavin, I think of you in terms of lending. I mean, this is being able to use less blunt instruments to lend to people who may have what are called thin credit files, that without a deep, rich credit history, and yet they were, they are actually, if you look more broadly at them, certainly willing, able to, pay and to have a loan. But I mean, that's off the top of my head. Have you got a favorite?
Yeah, I think it's actually an exciting time to be in the financial industry and technologist with things like AI. I think in the legacy environment where we can control the environment. So you walk into your branch, you go to the teller, you insert your card, your PIN reader there, she asks you for your driver's license. It's all a controlled environment, and it's probably the most part secure. That's not the future. In the future, as you mentioned, social media, your financial transaction is going to be happening out there, outside of our perimeters. We can't control it. So in an ideal world, we'd like to put a boundary around that, and we could protect the customer, we could protect the data, we could protect their money. But that's not how it's going to work in the future. When you think about those financial transactions happening in different forums, social media, digital, we want to be there with the customer. Although we might not be controlling the start point or the end point of it, we want to be there with the customer to help protect them, help protect their identity, help to make sure the payments are going where they need to go. That's where AI can play a big role. We need to start embedding that into the transactions. And that's a responsibility of the entire financial industry. It's not just one bank, because there's always two parties on a transaction, or multiple parties on a transaction. So as we think about the financial transaction, I think the legacy environment where it's very controlled and we could facilitate it is no longer the norm. So for us, it's how do we protect our customer? How do we help our customer in that transaction? And I think we're not going to be there, but if we can embed AI in the transaction, embed AI in our payment criteria and all that sort of stuff, it's an opportunity for us to protect our customer like that.
Ashley, you touched on it with labor and hiring, if you like. But do you have another one you like in terms of the positive side of this?
Yeah, obviously we're here because we love technology and want to see it evolve and grow and really benefit society. For me, yes, in addition to hiring and others that I've mentioned, I'd really like to see how we can actually use climate change to impact a lot of the sustainable development goals in a positive way, especially a lot of the different climate concerns that we have. There's a lot of amazing deep analysis that can be done to address some of these bigger societal challenges that we're facing. In particular, I know it's not always the most interesting topic of mind, but agriculture to me is super interesting. So how we can spread ensure food security through the better delivery of food, and even what we're seeing in India today in terms of increased COVID cases. Just lack of an access to food is a huge concern, and this is where AI can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, agriculture is really, and with plants, essentially what you do with people. You can do personalized, irrigation, drip irrigation and fertilization and so forth. And there's enormous differences even in a field when you look into it in terms of the micro environments that these plants live in. So the possibility of kind of bringing huge amount of productivity to the food basket is an excellent one. Let me ask, again, a general question for all of you. How do you see the market developing for responsible AI technology? I had an earlier conversation with Alka, she talked about the opportunity, ethics service providers. I look at this from, will it be something built into the big clouds? Or will those be more like operating systems and then specialists build apps that go on top of that? And I should think industry by industry, the proverbial verticals. I mean, does anybody have a view on how you see this market developing? Rajiv, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think, Steve, maybe all of the above. I think you're going to have infrastructure level, I think, providers, cloud providers that will wrap, essentially ethical, responsible AI principles and tools and techniques into, that foundational layer, if you will. And I think on top of that foundational layer, there'll be industry applications, assurance services around responsible AI, responsible ethical AI practices, much like you have financial assurance practices and whatnot to make sure that there's neutral third-party objective sort of assessment of how we're doing. And then organizations have to develop, in addition to that, their own specific policies, tools, and data sets. And I think one of the biggest issues is, I think, for AI to be trained on incomplete or, let's say, poor quality data. And then if humans are using that data to make decisions, then it's automatically subject to human constraints of scalability. But when machines learn at scale on incomplete or poor data, and then you're perpetuating that level of automation at scale, then there's a huge amount of work to do to go back and retroactively fix it. And that's much more problematic. So I think that's where there'll be a new class of providers to look at data sets that are being used by enterprises to say, is that complete? Is that of high quality? And also provide a set of assurance services around that, as well as tools to augment that.
Gavin, how about you? You're again in the same position of actually guiding purchase decisions in this field. What do you think?
No, I agree, Rajiv. I think it's going to be a bit of everything. I think as an industry, we'll take all the help we can get. I think the big techs, the cloud providers, are looking to put layers of offering services there, and I think we would use those in some cases. But some of the models are so specialized, and some of the solutions are so specialized that we'll always need some sort of vertical solution as well. One thing that the pandemic has showed us is a lot of our models weren't flexible. I mean, we didn't expect the 80-year-old granny to buy a bottle of whiskey from Amazon. With these new models that have changed, and the pandemic has shown us that we've had to evolve new models pretty quickly. So to do that at pace and scale, we do need the framework to make sure we do it the right way. So things like the certification, things like these ethical AI tools, or what we call the guide rails, or the control dashboard for AI, the safety belt to that. That's going to help us do this, because if we have to do it in the current way with a lot of manual hands-on, we won't get the full benefit of AI. So I think we want to move faster, but we know to do that we do need help to do that. We need certification, we need the tools, we need the transparency, like all the terms we've just used over here.
Thanks, Gavin. I also been asked to remind the viewers again that if you have questions, send them in as comments to either Facebook or YouTube, however you're watching this session. Let me ask a broad question for all of you. AI progress in general. Too fast? Are we going too fast or too slow? And why? Ashley?
I mean, it's an interesting thought discussion, but it doesn't really matter in that it's happening. And it's It's really whether we like it or not. Last night I was writing something like AI's everywhere and it does all these things as the text is predicting for me what I'm going to write. And I was like, yep, literally everywhere. So I think that it's again, it's hard to say, is it too fast, too slow? I think in many ways, we overestimate what AI can actually do and how intelligent it actually is. I'd love to get to the world that everybody, but in particular, what Rajiv was talking about with better healthcare and better access for patients, understanding what to do and when, like this is something I'd like to see. But that's really dependent on good, high quality data and also us putting these types of standards and guardrails in place. So I think that it's happening and it's happening really quickly. Do I think that the technology is exactly where we necessarily think it is? I think there's a lot of manual work that's going on to augment that automated work right now. That said, though, I'd like to see us get to these more utopian views of it that we've talked about, but do so in a meaningful way by developing it in an intentional way that I'd like to see more than just kind of technology for technology's sake.
Anybody else? Gavin, I mean, you're in a highly regulated industry. Are you concerned about regulation hampering innovation? And if so, what's your answer to forestalling those concerns that then get translated into regulation?
No, I wouldn't say we're concerned about it. I think we would like to move faster, but if you don't do it right, you'll cause more harm than good. So I think the regulators are supportive of how we want to use it, and let's be honest, they are using it as well. So they are using it to regulate us, and that will be common. So I think there's a consensus that it's the right place to be going. I think we are working together and using the example of the pandemic. They've embraced some of the ways we're using AI now to help our customers. So it's a benefit. It has to be applied the right way. And I think the way Ashley said it can do a lot of good. So there's no harm. We should just move forward.
Okay. Rajiv, got a thought?
Yeah, I think, Steve, the practice of medicine, I think, could absolutely stand to use AI more at scale today. And if you think about the average doc that has to deal with a pretty, a heavy volume of patients with hard to use electronic medical record systems that they have to deal with on top of the patient load, I think a lot of that could be made much more simple for the docs, and then much better for the consumers with use of AI for automation, as well as the use of AI for enhanced knowledge in the hands of our docs. Ultimately, they make the decision, but to get them the right insight right at the point of care, the technology is available, but years from being adopted at scale. So if I had a magic wand, that's the one thing I'd do to sort of use AI more broadly in the field of medicine.
We have some questions, so I'll filter in a few starting now, if that's okay. One of the questions is what's the definition of responsible AI? It's a buzzword that's thrown around everywhere. And I think that the general view is that it's, again, around these principles we've seen for a long time now, that it should be fair, it should combat bias, and it should be relatively transparent. But Ashley, that one's in your court to start with. I mean, when you say responsible AI, what do you mean?
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'd love to pass it over to Alka after this, because I know that she has done a lot of really good thinking on everything related to this in terms of how it also applies in a real implementation way, which is what we'd like to see, not just theoretically discussing such definitions. So for us at the Responsible AI Institute, or RAY, just getting used to our new name. We think about responsibility based in human rights. We adhere to the OECD principles, which all of you can check out on oecd.ai. And in that, we think about accountability. So the governance that the organization has set up to have some of the oversight guardrails that I've been speaking about, data quality, also relevant to some of the examples we've heard, bias and fairness. So looking at various different ways and techniques that we can ensure that there's equity and quality that is built into how these systems are being used, or again, the data that's being used, that it's fit for purpose. And then also looking at explainability and interpretability of the systems. So in line with what I was mentioning with human in the loop earlier, but just even how do you explain and understand why these systems are behaving in the way that they're intended to. And then last but not least, robustness, really looking at the safety and security of the system, along with any sort of changes that might occur. And that's what becomes really important with AI versus other types of technologies, is that they have the capacity to learn and to change. And so we want to make sure that they're continuing to behave in the way that we're expecting them to behave. And so I know I'm giving you more of a technical definition of it, but we like to think about all of those different aspects when thinking about the responsibility of these systems.
Elke, the baton is passed to you. You start, so take it.
Sure, no, happy to. And I'm probably going to try to weave in a couple of points that I wanted to share on some of the other really interesting questions that you had posed too. So when we think about responsible AI, so the responsible development and use of these technologies, and so our principles that we look at are really they're grounded in good engineering practices, but that it's not just about the technology piece. It's also about people and processes, right? And so people, in terms of, again, like the education piece and the training piece, I cannot underscore how important that is. I can't talk about responsible AI literacy within an organization until we have AI literacy, right? And so how do we bridge that gap, and how do we bring everyone up to the same common level of understanding? And then also thinking about operating structure. So what does the proper governance and oversight process look like within an organization? How do we build the bodies that are necessary for escalation of perhaps sensitive use cases within the service levels, all the way to the DoD level, and then also culture, right? So the DoD has a strong safety culture, and I can't say how critical that is when we're thinking about these AI capabilities and the technology. So when we're actually thinking about building these out, really. And Ashley's already touched on this, and I don't want to belabor the whole data aspect, as did many of our other panelists, but thinking through the data aspect, but T&E and B&B, and we haven't really spent too much time on thinking through the testing and evaluation part, but or talking about it. But at the JAIC, we have an amazing T&E group that is thinking through, all right, how do we test these models alone? How do we think about how they get integrated within the hardwares, within the hardware or the component that it's going to be utilized with? How are we thinking about the human-machine teaming aspect and calibrating for the right appropriate levels of trust? And then how are we thinking about testing these in an operational perspective? Because in some cases, we can't test some of these models in an operational perspective. And so that piece is really critical, as is thinking through the safety components. And then to Ashley's point, once these systems are deployed, what kind of monitoring are we utilizing? What kind of monitoring practices, tools are we using to get real-time feedback on perhaps emergent behavior of these technologies? And who's that feedback going to? And do they understand what that feedback is? So kind of bring in, I think your prior question is, are we going too fast or too slow on AI? I think there's still work to be done. On the technology side, I think on the people side, I think in some instances, there could be cases where people don't even know that AI is being utilized, so they don't understand the risks associated with it, right? Or the fact that they should be asking these questions. And so I think that, for those of us who are in these fields, we have an imperative and an obligation to really educate, inform, and create that awareness around what it means to talk about responsible AI.
Thanks very much. Good point, Saul, in particular on the data, which is something up again and again and is often neglected. That in many of these AI projects, 80% of the work is the curating and honing of the data, right? And people run around with T-shirts that say you are what you ETL, which is extract, transform, and load. I mean, the data, and it touches all these bias issues, obviously, as well. I mean, this was a facial recognition because it's trained on a limited set of data does very poorly with women of color, for example. I wrote about that years ago, but anyway. So thanks very much. It was really helpful. We have another question here from, actually got quite a few. And this one is for Rajiv, actually, and it's from Matt, and it's how to build AI systems that have a sense of emotion so that they, when you deal with people in call centers and some of this automation and AI you're doing, that it can sense the emotion and respond to it, as opposed to being, as he puts it, just if-then statements.
Yeah, so voice AI. So I mean, that's something that we use in our contact centers today. That in the customer service case, you can detect, perhaps irritability and level of angst, when a customer is calling in, and rather than go through sort of a prefix sort of escalation of how you might handle that case. There's a different tack that our customer service agents can take, prompted by an AI that says, do this instead of kind of your regular menu of options. Kind of a simple way to sort of improve customer satisfaction and resolve issues more effectively, and also get an outcome of reducing customer sort of angst in calling into our contact centers and dealing with more empathy. So that's one example. Other things that we're seeing, incidentally, Steve, is in virtual health, as we're having many docs and patients are having sessions like the one we're having now, in introducing voice AI and detection of sentiment in voice and other medical conditions. There's almost like a sidebar of things that AI is detecting based on a conversation that are prompts for the doc. They could look at it and say, yeah, well, okay, that doesn't make sense. Teach the AI to ignore that. Or the AI might pick up something that the doc isn't, just based on voice inflection and intonation and use of certain words, and prompt the doc for certain things to look for. And early stages on that, but really interesting sort of applications down the road. If you think about what we might be able to do with behavioral therapy, other things that you might say it's actually better to have a virtual visit than an in-person visit, because then you can have AI sort of in the background affecting things more effectively, perhaps in conjunction with docs.
Thanks. And Melvin has a question for Ashley. Do you have any lessons from the Canadian experience in terms of AI development and deployment?
Yeah, a lot. There's in a government. Yeah. Well, I'll say it more generally, I guess. In like any large company, and I can only imagine the span and scope that both Gavin, Rajiv, and actually Elka have in terms of thinking about all of the different ways that these systems can be used. And as we've talked about, it's becoming part of all of these different aspects of what we do, and in many ways ensemble together. And so one of the things that we really had to think about as policymakers in the government of Canada was you can't write a policy necessarily that's one size fits all, that's going to catch all of the various different things that you should be doing and should be thinking about. And so you can start to set, and that's why we keep saying guardrails, because right now we've started to take these big high level principles, turn them into something that's actionable. But our scope was really looking at derailing of trains and monitors that were being put on trains, all the way to whether or not there should be people that should be allowed from other countries to study and have expedited visas for study in Canada. And so just the span of control that you need to look at and think about, you can see the type of different subject matter experts that you need, not only to build those systems and then have the background knowledge for that, but also to then be thinking about the potential impact and unintended consequences that those could have. So this is what I would say, is that independent of what any of those individual use cases are or what your organization does, technology is powering and AI is powering so much that we really need to make sure that we're bringing in the appropriate subject matter experts to the table. It can't just be engineers and product owners that are building these systems in a silo. Talk to your lawyer, talk to an ethicist, talk to psychologists in some circumstances. I loved the example that Rajiv gave with the call centers. And make sure also, most importantly, that you're talking to the affected population or consulting them or thinking about the impact that they might have when you're designing and developing these systems.
Great. We're running out of time, but we have one question from Doreen for all of you. How can people get involved and make sure they're creating ethical AI? Elka, you're a person who actually did that.
So I think organizations like Ashley's are prime places to actually get involved and have meaningful impact. So, the Responsible AI Institute is definitely a place to go. And there's a number of different sort of groups that you see if you just online in terms of communities that are thinking about this, right? So communities who might be really focused on the data aspect or like the technology aspect versus an organizational aspect and the governance aspect versus a regulatory aspect. So I think there's a lot of those types of communities because the awareness is increasing. And policymakers are now, they're trying to get up to speed and they're trying to understand how to address these types of issues. And I will just say briefly, in the U.S. government, the NSEI, the National Security Commission on AI, just released a report in March, which was like over 700 pages, but there's really good stuff in there. And so there's a lot of different types of communities that are building up around trying to increase education awareness, trying to increase regulatory awareness, trying to educate policymakers, trying to think about the technology aspect. So I think there's a lot of different areas to go to. But I think, of course, with Ashley and all the work that she's doing, she is bringing all of those various communities together. And I think that's where you can jump in and make an impact.
Look, I think we're right about out of time. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for their contribution, the audience for listening, and George Washington University for sponsoring this event. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.